Mapping Jordan DNA Origins. We're going to review the results of genetic testing done by 23andMe and Ancestry.com. These are two companies that do genetic testing and then try to match the origins of the genetics that they find with the global sites where the ancestors might have originated. And so I've submitted my DNA testing to 23andMe and Ancestry.com. And we're going to see what they tell us. We're going to look at the results from September and October 2025. I have previous results that they had sent earlier, but they have improved their matrix for their testing, and they've changed some of the population of the genes that they test. And so we have new results that they think are more accurate. Now, Ancestry.com is linked to a website where individuals can also work on their family tree. And so Ancestry.com's genetic testing has identified 33 living and descendants of Baxton Jordan, who was my great ancestor. These individuals have all been tested by Ancestry.com, and they are all on the Ancestry.com trees. And so they do link in with my family tree, and I have now confirmed that the testing is correct for what is represented by my family tree. Let's look at the results. We're going to compare the most recent results of Ancestry.com, which are the numbers on the left, with those of 23andMe, numbers on the right after the slash. So if we look first at England and Northwest Europe, 73% Ancestry.com, 67.1% 23andMe. Now, Ancestry.com in their most recent version breaks it down more specifically to say that Southwest England, Europe, 63%, West Midlands, England, 7%, Northeast England, 3%. That would be like the area of York. So they're a little more specific than 23andMe, but they essentially match. Wales, we're seeing 10% versus 6.8%. That's a pretty close match. Northwest Germany, 4% versus 3.6%, Ancestry.com. And they include in that 1.2% for Lorraine, as in Alsace-Lorraine. Scotland, initially, Ancestry.com was reporting 19%. But in the most recent results, they state 0. On the other hand, 23andMe was reporting almost no Scots blood in their earlier test and now reports 12.3%. If we look at the Netherlands, it's 4% versus 4.3%. And Ancestry.com, 23andMe also identifies another 0.2% Belgian. If we look at the Irish testing, the most recent tests on 23andMe don't identify any Irish. They did identify it earlier by counties without any percentage. On the other hand, Ancestry.com did not identify any Irish earlier and now identifies it 4% from Leicester, 2% from Munster, 1% from Donegal. Ancestry identifies 2% Icelandic or Scandinavian genes, whereas 23andMe breaks it down as to 0.9% Swedish, 0.2% Norwegian. There are some additional nationalities reported on 23andMe that they hadn't reported before. 2% Italian. I don't think that's from when I was living in Catania, Sicily. 0.8% Slovenian. 0.4% Russian. I think the Slovenian's probably Maria Marsh, who was my Bohemian 8th great grandmother. Let's look at the results now as mapped out by 23andMe, showing where they're saying that the 62% British Irish 28% French-German are all located. If you look at the map for Ancestry.com, we're seeing that they're saying it's broadly English and North European, 63%. We want to zero in a little more closely. If we look at the English genetics on 23andMe, we see that they're identifying the Midlands and Upper England. The earlier ancestry report had 19% Scots Gaelic, 17% on the paternal side, and 2% on the maternal side. Well, they've changed their testing significantly, and now they're not reporting any Scots, whereas the Scots on the new reports from 23andMe is at 12.3%. Well, we know we've got Scots blood because I can identify John Guthrie of Ayrshire, born in 1682, as one of my ancestors. He's my 7th great-grandfather. He comes from the Guthrie clan. Guthrie's remembered by the Laird of Guthrie, who went to France in 1299 to convince William Wallace to return to Scotland to try to negotiate with the king. It didn't turn out too well for William Wallace. You'll remember him from the movie Braveheart. I've got other identified Scottish ancestors like Jane Stewart of Edinburgh or George Logan of Kilwinning. So we know that we've got it there, although it didn't get reported this time in Ancestry, and previously it was reported at 19%. Wales, both of them are fairly congruent, 10% from Ancestry, whereas 23andMe says 6.8%. I can identify the immigrant, Benjamin Roberts, 1711. Let's look at the old sod now, the Emerald Isle of Irie. Now, Ancestry is reporting most recently 7% Irish ancestry, 4% Leinster, 2% Munsterite, 1% Donegal. And I know I have a 4th great-grandfather, William Benjamin Kane, from Donegal, 1765. I know John Shagog of Monaghan in Ulster came with his spouse, Eleanor Daring, and she was from Dublin. And they were in 1766. If we look at the testing that 23andMe did, they do identify counties where there was positive marks, but that was in their previous testing. They don't report any percentage in Ireland this time. If we look at the report from Ancestry saying that I've got 2% Icelandic ancestry, whereas 23andMe reports the Scandinavian ancestry is 0.9% Swedish and 2% Norwegian. This is probably from the Anglo-Saxon invasions on the British island. My Saxon ancestors were descendants from the Geats of southern Sweden, and they eventually came and settled in southeastern England. And if you go to my movie or look at the family tree, you'll see where the inheritance comes from the British side that married in with the Frankish side. My Germanic ancestry, they're saying 26% on Ancestry.com. About 24% they were saying came from Baden-Württemberg, which would be where the Ellers came from. That is my mother's maiden name. In addition, they are also identifying a lesser amount from Cologne and other areas. That was where many of my ancestors lived. And Aachen and Cologne was where the Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne was headquartered. So all my relatives are settled up and down the Rhine and the Lorraine Valley in areas like Metz. And it's represented by 1.2% of my genetics, according to 23andMe. They both, Ancestry and 23andMe, identify Dutch ancestry, 5% and 4.3% respectively. And I do identify Captain Frans Janssen Bloodgort of Goede Holland, who was a captain and navigator who sailed the Atlantic, came to America in 1632. So now that we've got a general idea of where everybody came from, let's see if we can match up specifically with ancestors who came to America. So let's look at those branches where I have been able to identify an ancestor who came from Europe. I as close as could, identified either their year of immigration, their birth or death year, and where they came from and what their relationship is to me. And we can see that that Bohemian, Mary Marish, was my 8th great-grandmother, came from East Bohemia. And we see the all identified immigrants from England, Germany, Holland, Ireland, Scotland, Wales. There are only a few branches where I do not have an identified ancestor immigrant yet, so this is probably 70% of them. Let's look on the map where all those places are located. We can see that they pretty much match the areas that we've seen earlier in the genetic mapping. Let's go to the most specific one we can think of. Let's follow the Jordan male line coming from just outside of London in Gatwick in Surrey. And that would be Arthur Archibald Jordan, a gentleman of Surrey. He immigrated from Gatwick, England, to the Virginia colony about 1630. We know that because his son was born in England in 1627. Now, Archibald died in America in 1635, so we know he came before that. He was about 500 years too early to fly out of Gatwick Airport, which is the site of where the old family homestead was located. Now, Arthur came along with his son that I mentioned, who came as a child. That's Arthur Henry Jordan II. So when they came with his father, they were pretty fortunate to get out of England when they did, because the English Civil War broke out in 1642 and lasted until 1651. And then they didn't have much of a break before the Great Plague hit England in 1665 and lasted until the Great Fire of London in 1666 burned out all the rats and all the rat fleas. And then it ended the plague. A hell of a treatment. Now, Arthur and his father, when they moved to the colony of Virginia, lived on what was called Surrey Side. That was the land that was across the river, the James River, from Jamestown, the original English colony there. It was named Surrey County in memory of Surrey County, England. Now, his son was George Arthur Jordan, who lived on the Virginia coast. People didn't go inland very far. It was all just forests and Indians once you left the coastline. His son was Thomas Jordan. He converted from Church of England to Quakerism. He was a famous outspoken Quaker. And one of his sons was Drury Jordan. Now, Drury was born in Brunswick County in Virginia on the coastline there. And if you see from the map, the little pink area is the area around 1700 that was settled by the colony. All the rest was Indians and forests. Over time, the settlers did start to spread out, and Drury spread out south and with his family down towards South Carolina. And eventually he went with his son Drury Jr. to Tennessee, where he passed away in 1805. Several of his sons settled in South Carolina, and some of them settled in Georgia. One of his sons was Baxton Jordan. Now, Baxton's sometimes listed as Baxter in many textbooks. That's because the textbooks are typing transcriptions of old manuscripts, and the handwriting is often misinterpreted. We know that he signed his name Baxton. We can tell that by an affidavit he signed about a Creek Indian attack that he and his wife survived in 1779 in Georgia. His neighbor later sued the state to try to get compensation for loss of property and cattle, and Baxter and his wife testified as to the neighbor's losses. You see here a copy of the affidavit with Baxton's signature and Margaret's mark, because she was apparently illiterate. Now, Baxton served in the 2nd Regiment of the Georgia Continental Army. He fought in the Florida campaigns in British Florida near Jacksonville. As a result of gaining a lot of Creek lands after running off the Indians and settling with treaties, the white men stole a lot of the territory, they started giving it away to others, and they awarded 200 acres to any white male head of household who asked for it, who would settle in Georgia, and another 50 acres for any dependent family members. So Baxter received 250 acres of land in Georgia, and also, because of his service in the Revolutionary War for Georgia, he received 318 acres of land. Now, he kept some of the land, he sold some of the land, he gave some of the land to family members. He seemed to travel back and forth between his original hometown of Darlington, where he was later buried in South Carolina, and in Wilkes County, later known as Washington County. The county names kept changing over time. But he seemed to travel on what was called the Fall Line Road. This was a road that was built between the towns that were settled on the falls on the rivers, where the Piedmont from the mountains dropped quickly to the coastal plains, and there were waterfalls on the rivers. The waterfalls were able to power water mills, and that was the type of power that was used before the steam age in colonial America. So the various little towns were connected by that Fall Line Road, and that's the one he would have traveled back and forth on. The only other road in colonial America at the time was the Coast Main Road, or Mail Road. So now we know that the genetic testing confirms a bloodline for 38 descendants by DNA matches, and include me, Thomas Edison Jordan Jr. Baxton is my 5th great-grandfather. So this genetic testing confirms that these individuals have shared DNA from Baxton. We're all descended from him. And if we match our trees on Ancestry.com, we can confirm that the trees are aligning with the genetic testing. Now, if we go back from Baxton, I can trace the male lineage of the Jordan branch of the tree back through the Norman conquest of England by the Normans and the Franks, through my Frankish ancestry in the Carolingian dynasty, and to the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, all the way past him to Roman consul Flavius Ricimerus in 350 AD, or even his father, who was Tudemer, king of the Salian Franks. I hope that this has been an entertaining and perhaps educational review for you of some history that's associated with the bloodline of the Jordans of Quercy. Thank you very much.